Margaret stood at her kitchen window watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across her ranch land. The coffee in her hands had grown cold while she lost herself in memories of better times. 3 years had passed since Robert died, and still she found herself setting 2 cups on the counter each morning before catching her mistake. The sound of boots on gravel drew her attention to the yard below. Jake Morrison was walking toward the house with that slow, measured gait she remembered from their younger days. His shoulders seemed broader now somehow, though she knew it was probably just the weight of his own losses that made him carry himself differently. His wife Sarah had been gone nearly 5 years, and Margaret wondered if he still set 2 coffee cups out in the mornings too. Jake had been Robert's closest friend since childhood. They had built their ranches side by side and raised their families together through all the seasons of joy and sorrow that make up a life well lived. After Robert passed, Jake had taken on the burden of helping Margaret keep her place running, even though his own ranch demanded most of his time and attention. She opened the door before he could knock. The morning air carried the scent of sage and distant rain clouds gathering on the horizon. Jake removed his hat and held it against his chest in that old-fashioned way that reminded her of her grandfather. "Morning, Margaret," he said quietly. His voice carried that rough edge that came from years of calling cattle across wide-open spaces. "Thought I might check on those fence posts in the south pasture today if you don't mind the company." Margaret smiled and stepped aside to let him in. The kitchen felt warmer with another person in it, even though neither of them spoke much while she poured fresh coffee and set out the plate of biscuits she had baked the night before. Some companionship didn't need words to fill the spaces between heartbeats. They sat at the old oak table that had witnessed countless family meals and important conversations over the decades. Jake wrapped his weathered hands around the coffee mug and stared out the window toward the pasture where a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sunshine. "Margaret," he began slowly, "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about what comes next for both of us." She waited without rushing him. Jake had never been one to waste words, and she knew whatever he wanted to say had been carefully considered during those long, quiet hours that made up most of their days now. "We're not young anymore," he continued, "but we're not ready for rocking chairs on the front porch either. This land means everything to both of us, and I hate seeing you struggle to keep it all together by yourself." Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest. These conversations always seemed to lead toward suggestions that she sell the ranch and move somewhere smaller and easier to manage. She had heard it from her children and her meaning neighbors and even the banker in town who watched her finances with growing concern. "I know what you're going to say, Jake, and I appreciate your worry, but I can't give up this place. Robert and I built our whole life here. Our children learned to walk in these rooms and ride horses in that corral out there. I can't just walk away from all of that." Jake shook his head slowly. "That's not what I'm suggesting, Margaret. Not at all." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was gentle and warm and completely unexpected. Margaret felt her breath catch somewhere between surprise and something she couldn't quite name. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said simply. "I know it might sound strange after all these years of friendship, but I think we could build something good together. We both understand loss, and we both know how precious it is to have someone who truly understands what matters most in life." Margaret stared at him for a long moment. She had never imagined this conversation happening between them. Jake had always been Robert's friend first and hers by extension. She had never thought of him as anything more than a neighbor who helped with the heavy work and shared coffee on difficult mornings. "Jake, I don't know what to say. You've been so kind to me since Robert died, but marriage is something entirely different. I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of change." Jake nodded as if he had expected exactly this response. "I understand your hesitation, Margaret. I felt the same way when the idea first occurred to me. But we're both alone in these big empty houses, and we're both struggling to maintain places that were meant to be shared by families." He paused and looked directly into her eyes with an intensity she had never seen from him before. "I can give you children again, Margaret. I know you always wanted a larger family, and Robert's illness came before you could have more babies. We could start fresh together and fill this house with laughter again." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She pulled her hand away from his and stood up abruptly. The chair scraped against the wooden floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence between them. "Jake, you don't understand what you're saying," she whispered. "I'm 58 years old. Those dreams of babies and growing families ended long ago. I made peace with what my life was going to be. Jake stood up too and moved around the table toward her. Age doesn't matter, Margaret. My aunt had a baby when she was 45. And my grandmother always said women in our family stayed fertile longer than most. We could try, at least. We could see what happens if we're brave enough to take that chance together. Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. The conversation had taken a turn she never could have anticipated, and suddenly she felt like she was drowning in possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. I need you to leave, Jake, she said quietly but firmly. I need time to think about this without you here watching me and waiting for an answer I don't have. Jake's face fell, but he reached for his hat without argument. I didn't mean to upset you, Margaret. That was never my intention. I just thought maybe we could find a way to help each other through whatever years we have left. After he left, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen for hours, watching the light change as the sun moved across the sky. The house felt emptier than usual, and she found herself questioning everything she thought. She knew about her own heart and her own future. That evening she called her daughter Linda, who lived in Denver with her husband and 2 teenage children. Linda had been suggesting for months that Margaret consider selling the ranch and moving closer to family, where she could be looked after properly. Mom, you sound different tonight, Linda said after they had talked about the weather and the grandchildren's latest activities. Is everything all right out there? Margaret found herself telling Linda about Jake's proposal and his strange suggestion about having children together. She expected her daughter to laugh or express concern about Jake's mental state, but Linda was quiet for a long time before responding. Mom, do you have feelings for Jake that go beyond friendship? Linda asked gently. I honestly don't know, Margaret admitted. I never thought about him that way before today. He was always just part of the landscape of my life with your father, but now I can't stop thinking about what it would mean to share this place with someone again. What about the baby thing, Mom? That seems a little unrealistic at your age. Margaret sighed deeply. That's the part that bothers me most, Linda. I think Jake is holding on to some fantasy about recapturing youth and starting over completely. I can't be part of that kind of thinking. It's not fair to either of us. They talked for another hour before Linda said something that stayed with Margaret long after they hung up. Mom, maybe Jake isn't trying to go backward. Maybe he's just trying to figure out how to go forward with hope instead of just resignation. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn and dressed carefully in her best jeans and the blue cotton blouse that Robert had always said brought out the color in her eyes. She braided her graying hair and applied a touch of lipstick before walking out to the barn where she kept Robert's old hunting rifle. The weight of the gun felt familiar in her hands. She and Robert had spent many evenings shooting targets behind the barn, and she had always been a decent shot, even though she never enjoyed hunting the way he did. Today the rifle felt like a symbol of something she couldn't quite put into words. Jake arrived at his usual time and found her sitting on the front porch steps with the rifle across her knees. He stopped walking when he saw her and stood very still as if he were trying to read some message in her posture and expression. Good morning, Margaret, he said carefully. That's quite a greeting you have for me today. Margaret looked up at him and felt her heart do something unexpected. In the early morning light, Jake looked younger somehow, and she noticed things about him she had never paid attention to before. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The careful way he moved as if he were always mindful of taking up too much space in other people's lives. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, Jake, and I need you to understand something very clearly. I cannot and will not be part of any fantasy about having babies or starting some kind of second family. That part of my life is over, and I've made peace with that reality. Jake nodded slowly and took a few steps closer to the porch. I hear what you're saying, Margaret, and I respect that. I think maybe I got carried away yesterday with dreams that don't make sense for people our age. Margaret stood up and held the rifle loosely at her side. But I